younger people and more educated people are not more likely to support intercaste marriage or have intercaste marriages themselves. We are in a country where you cannot get elected as a Muslim unless you are in a Muslim majority constituency is deeply concerning. But I am sorry, crime reporting in this country needs regulation. It defies and goes against the rights of not just complainants but also the accused. I've really reached a point where I feel bad that what we're doing is basically penalizing states that do a better job of reporting for having a large number of crimes or COVID cases in that, as the case may be.
Did you know that a Alok Foundation Oxford University survey in 2017 found that one third of the young people it surveyed were against intercaste marriages? Did you know that many surveys have found that Indians have low regard for democracy? Did you also know that when it comes to crime data, if there is more crime in a state, it does not necessarily mean that law and order in that state is in tatters? As a journalist, how does one look at data? Can we define India according to data, or is it simply exhausting? This is what a new book called Whole Numbers and Half Truths by award winning journalist Rukmini S. looks at. Rukmini makes a passionate argument in this book that there is a wealth of data in India, but many times we overlook it. She says that at other times we do have the data, but we don't look at the context, thereby we skew the interpretation. I found this book fascinating and I will be in conversation with Rukmini today. But before we go into that conversation, let me remind you, become members of the News Minute and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Last week, we launched a show called Let Me Explain with Anna Isaac, and more shows are in the pipeline. Hello, Rukmini. Thank you for joining me. Rukmini, you start the book by saying numbers enlighten, empower, elevate. Numbers can help us make sense of modern India. So tell me, when did your fascination with numbers and data begin? And what have been some of your biggest lessons till now?
Thanks for that. I think people who grew up with me, like my brother, actually would find it very surprising that this is what I do now, because I didn't really develop, display any great either aptitude or I didn't display any signs of this growing up. I have to say, I didn't study it as well. I didn't study maths or stats or economics or any of that. I went into journalism and sort of was a field reporter in Mumbai and in Maharashtra. When I went to do a master's, or sort of after 5, 6 years in the profession, that was the first time I encountered research around countries, including India, and statistics was one of them, one of the things I was looking at. And I think that's the time at which I felt that the frustration I had been feeling with sort of he said, she said journalism, especially around elections, was something that hopefully and potentially I could, help fill in some of the gaps in this with data. So that's sort of how I got into it. And then I really think I just ended up learning and loving this on the job, which is once I started dealing with numbers and statistics and using them as a way to tell stories, I loved it and continued doing it.
So Rukmini's book has several chapters. In fact, a few of the chapters look at how Indians think, how Indians vote, Indian democracy, etc. Now, one thing which really struck me, Rukmini, is a chapter in which you talk about how Indians think and feel, in which you talk about a particular survey that says that India, along with Pakistan and Russia, featured below the global average on the importance according to democracy. Indians, in fact, had an even lower regard than Pakistanis for civil rights that protects people's liberty against oppression as being an essential part of democracy. So tell me more about how Indians feel, especially about democracy. And did you find these results really baffling?
So I think this chapter is really a good example of all the things that you don't realize going into writing a book. And I should confess that this chapter was in fact an afterthought. It's the last one I wrote because I'm more used to dealing with more hard numbers, not sort of opinion and attitudinal numbers. But I knew that we have a bunch of surveys around thoughts and beliefs, and I knew that they are all from decent sources and would make for a good chapter. I think because I have encountered these numbers frequently, and the reason I put them all together is because these are multiple surveys that point in the same direction. It isn't that one survey that's saying this one unusual thing about India. They all, over time, have systematically showed this sort of authoritarian streak that runs through the country, this pretty strong disregard for basic human rights of fellow citizens that survey after survey have shown. So it's been interesting also to me to see how much this chapter has struck other people, because it's one of those things that you know remember as a journalist, that sometimes you think that these are known things because you encounter them all the time, but when they're all brought together, they do surprise people considerably. So I think there's a sort of comforting lie that that many of us have held to ourselves, which is that there is a fringe that's authoritarian, undemocratic, intolerant, while the core of the country is sort of tolerant and believing and is a bit live and let live. And unfortunately, I don't think that that's grounded in any sort of data. Most data, I mean, I think there was a sort of belief that Indians feel like broadly like live and let live, except in their personal lives, they might not choose to marry someone from another religion or caste. But I don't think they broadly feel live and let live either. I think it's important to look at these numbers to realize that none of these are fringe beliefs. They're very much sort of core and central to the country. And it's important also to realize that, because then if there is a feeling that you want these beliefs to change, if there is that sort of project, then you have to think of pretty considerable things that will be needed to change it, maybe right from school and from education. There's a lot. If all of these indicators together throw a light on such sort of fundamental disregard for basic civil and human rights.
So, one more thing which struck me, in fact, in the same chapter is the study which you quote from Gujarat, Haryana, Karnataka, and Odisha. And you've written that as levels of education rose, so did the support for restrictions on speech. How do you view that?
So, that's a great point. And I think, again, this is one of those trends that you see repeated in various different sorts of aspects through the book, which is that education does not equal to more liberal values. And you see this whether it is in the proportion of people who give and take dowry. You see this across the board, that if there was a sort of broad belief that more education, broad sort of urbanization, that these trends would lead to broadly more progressive beliefs, this is something that has now been quite comprehensively shown that in India, this is not how the trend is going to be. So if we sort of leave these bigger projects of things like, regard for free speech, free expression, that sort of thing, if we sort of leave it to, well, as states grow and develop and as people get better educated, these are sort of beliefs they will move towards. I think we're seeing quite clearly that these are not automatic processes. And perhaps this is how other countries in the world have gone. And this is how sort of political theory believes that countries change. But I think we're going to have to think of a new political theory for our own country that takes into account the fact that things, for example, younger people and more educated people are not more likely to support intercaste marriage or have intercaste marriages themselves. So this is not an automatic process, perhaps the opposite even. And so we're going to have to think about very active steps that we'll need to take as a country if we believe that this is a project of change.
I would say that's a very ominous thought. If education is not going to let a person believe in freedom of speech or in any kind of progress and liberty, right? I mean, that's really ominous. And like you said, it's a project that we all have to work on. But to your answer to my previous question, you said that there are lots of myths which Indians have about themselves, that we are secular, we are a forgiving nation, we are a loving nation. Does data really puncture a lot of these myths or beliefs which we have about ourselves?
Absolutely. I think sometimes if you have broadly liberal values and the people around you do, that too tends to become a bit of a bubble or an echo chamber where you sort of try to imagine that what you think is, these good values, that you imagine that most of the country shares them, and that there is this core of respect for these sort of values, along with this myth being punctured for me that the core, that the majority of the country does not ascribe to these progressive values. I'd say another sort of myth that gets punctured is this one about all of us loving to call ourselves middle class. That's again something that when you look at either income or consumption data, you realize that that's again a sort of comforting myth that we hold around ourselves that isn't really true. So yeah, I think data does a good job in that way. Especially representative national Indian data is so valuable because it helps you realize just how small, how narrow your sliver of the country is, the one that you live in and the one that you might think more broadly about, just how narrow it is. Nationally representative Indian data does show you that.
So, since I've been a political reporter, there's one chapter and one conclusion that you've drawn, which I really want you to explain to me. I mean, I do agree with you to a large extent. You said the genre of election reporting should be ignored mostly. Why do you say that? Why do you feel so strongly that election reporting in India does not reflect reality many times?
So let me say that there's a particular way that a lot of election reporting is done, and let me even say was done at the point at which I started looking at data, which I found particularly sort of troublesome and dangerous in the sense that it was giving a sort of veneer of certainty to narratives that were purely being picked up by individual reporters, and then sort of through a bit of a group think became established narratives. And I think the type of journalism that needs to die, the type of political journalism that needs to sort of go into its graveyard, is the land into a constituency, speak to four people and say this is how Jats vote and this is how women vote. That's the sort of political reporting that really needs to end. But neither News Minute nor many of the other many much of the reporting being done by younger journalists in particular isn't following this sort of old trope of Indian political journalism. So I don't think that all of that needs to be disregarded. And as you'll see, even in the book, I do rely on political reporting done by journalists as well to piece together bits of the country. So at one point, I've talked about how we shouldn't assume that women vote for things that are necessarily different from what men vote for, and women have multiple identities which intersect. And many of those, when I look at some of what women voters in 2019 were voting for, those stories are by individual reporters on the ground, but they sort of help add together a more nuanced picture of women voters than perhaps even the data can show. So I suppose my biggest argument is for triangulation, for not for one type of reporting or the other to be seen as the answer to everything. In fact, I don't even think that data driven opinion polling around elections is the answer in itself, because I feel it's very reductive. And sometimes what is taken, again, these are sort of narratives that we've that are beloved, which is things like Indians vote for development and are a post caste electorate, that sort of thing, which looking at just one answer in an opinion poll or the way the questions are structured tend to give you that. So any political reporter would tell you that we are not a post caste society, and all political reporters see that on the ground. They see the sort of centrality to caste in the way people report. So that would be an instance in which political reporting from the ground would puncture the myths that were coming from data driven reporting. I do think it can work both ways.
So, what would you say is ideal good election reporting? What would you envisage that to be?
Yes, I suppose what I would think of would be a combination of a bit of, I mean, you could call it quantitative and qualitative, or in a newsroom, you'd call it sort of data and field reporting, that sort of thing. I think you need data to say a few key things. It helps you establish things like the demographic makeup of a constituency or a state. It tells you about development indicators and how they might matter. It tells you about representation dynamics. And then again, opinion polling gives you some indications of things that matter. And then I would imagine that reporters could take some of those findings to the ground and see ways in which they were falling apart. Things that come up through the data but came later. Things like how the BJP was sort of systematically targeting non-Jatav scheduled castes in UP, for example, is something that would have come through field reporting or even political reporters talking to politicians, that classic political reporting in that sense. And then that is something that you see in the numbers, when in opinion polling later, you see that, yes, these groups tended to vote more for the BJP. So perhaps the ideas then came from the political reporting and then the data picked it up later. So a bit of both, I suppose, bringing it together to tell a whole.
So for those watching, I'm not going to tell you every chapter which Rukmini deals with. You really have to buy the book and read it. But there's another chapter on politics which fascinates me. I mean, there's more than politics in the book. There's crime, there's health, there's a lot of things. But one chapter which really fascinated me was about the ghettoization. You speak about Muslims and Dalits. I'm going to read one or two lines from page 67. You said that despite lazy characterizations of a range of constituencies as Muslim dominated, there are only 15 constituencies that actually have a population of more than 50% Muslims across India. 13 of these 15 constituencies elected Muslim MPs in the 2019 Lok Sabha election, but in the rest of the country, the odds of getting elected decline sharply for a Muslim hopeful if a constituency has lesser than 20% Muslims. Now, politicians like OIC have been always speaking about this, that there is, and you also have given numbers about how the BJP as a party does not even have Muslim candidates in many of its state elections and even in the Lok Sabha elections. So, OIC, for example, has always been saying that there is a clear attempt to drive out Muslims from electoral politics, from the democratic space. Numbers support that, doesn't it, Rukmini?
Yes, I actually find it, beyond the numbers, even I find it sort of morally unconscionable that we as a country are okay with a situation in which a Muslim representative can only get elected from a Muslim majority constituency. We like to think of ourselves sometimes, we might compare ourselves with US politics, for example, where, it has multiple other feelings, but to think that we are in a country where you cannot get elected as a Muslim unless you are in a Muslim majority constituency is deeply concerning. And I suppose one of the things that happens over here is that you end up looking at the difference between the situation of Muslim candidates and what happens when you reserve constituencies for Dalits, for example, because in some ways similar dynamics could have played out, because even in the reserve constituencies of the country, which is another sort of number fact that I don't think comes out so often, Dalits are a minority in reserved constituencies. We don't tend to think of it that way, and journalists sometimes use the outcomes of reserved constituencies as shorthand for how Dalits voted, which doesn't make any numerical sense because Dalits are a minority in these in reserved constituencies as well. But I suppose the outcome of what we see in terms of representation for Dalits through affirmative action poses a sort of counterpoint to what is happening with the political ghettoization of Muslims, and it raises questions of perhaps legislative means towards a broader project of equity. But that goal is so far from the country that we live in right now that it's almost pointless to talk about it.
So, Rukmini, in the book, you have very elaborately written about how certain narratives like Indians vote for development. It's not correct. You have punctured that entire narrative, and people can read the book to understand how you have punctured the narrative with data, of course. But my question to you is, in those chapters, you eventually lead on to say that some of these changes are not organic. For example, people voting because they feel nationalistic, or they feel like a political party identifies with a religion that they believe in. Sometimes these feelings are not organic. The media tends to play a big role in shaping these narratives. What has been your take, especially on television news channels in the Hindi heartland, for example? What has their impact been on how India really votes?
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that I wish there was better research on. Sometimes people ask me, what do you wish there was better data on? And this is one of the things I wish there was better work on the impact of the media, because many of us hardly watch television news anymore. And after moving away from Delhi and living in Chennai as I do now, I don't watch Hindi channels anymore. But sometimes, if you're in an airport or it somehow comes across your screen, it's shocking that these are the narratives that are being put out. The horrendous dog whistling and Islamophobic baiting that is sort of endemic across many of these channels is pretty shocking to watch. Although there isn't data on it, I do think that the amount of airtime that was given to the BJP in both 2014 and 2019 is something that the data shows. And we do know that at least in 2014, the BJP did systematically better with more media exposed people. However, these people also tend to sort of correlate better with the BJP's core constituency. So, you couldn't directly draw causal analysis. I suppose it's one more of those things where I feel, yes, we don't really have the data to show exactly what the impact is, but again, from moving away from a data to sort of a broad state of democracy issue, it's again one of those things that it's unconscionable that some channels spend, the majority of their airtime is basically Islamophobic baiting night after night after night.
So the important takeaway is that you watch television only when you pass it on an airport, in an airport, when you look at the TV screen. It's almost the same for me. But I just thought
Like
about it a few
I have
days
little
ago.
kids, and as you know, with little kids, putting on news channels is just
Yeah, it's like,
impossible.
it's real. No, I actually thought the other day that the fact that I don't watch TV does not mean that other people are not getting polluted or corrupted by watching TV. Therefore, I've been telling myself that you should watch more of TV and start calling out, protesting. Otherwise, there's no point, right? But that's
Yeah,
detrimental to my
absolutely agree.
health.
It's
So
one of those things that you feel that, you are maybe leaving yourself in your bubble without realizing what's happening in the broader media exposed.
I know it's like saying caste doesn't exist because I don't believe in caste. It's almost the same thing to me. Rukmini, another question I wanted to ask you. I don't know if it's a generalization, but the book clearly says there is data to show that meat eating is increasing in India. But if you look at states, people tend to eat meat more in the southern states when compared to a lot of states in North India. When it comes to religion, there are more people in South India, though the number is not huge. Still, there are more people in South India who believe that religion is not that important in their lives. Now, if you look at up the politics in South India, for example, in Tamil Nadu or Kerala or Telangana, do you believe that there is a correlation between our politics, the way we eat, the way we look at religion, or is that too much of a generalization?
No, I think there's very good reasons to feel that way, because the socio-political movements that date back 100 years in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, which led to which gave birth not just to empowerment movements, to social justice movements, to the political parties that we see today, all of those undeniably have an impact on everything from development indicators to religious practices to political beliefs as well. I will say I was quite surprised by the finding in the Pew survey on religion, which showed that people in southern states, including Tamil Nadu, give less importance to being religious in their lives than those in some of the northern states. Not because I feel that the southern states are intolerant. I don't, but I do. I see a significant centrality to religion in southern states as well. But perhaps it isn't. It doesn't take over other aspects of life in the same way that it does in other states. But yes, short answer is that all of the social and political indicators and differences that we can see in the southern states today date back to the movements that date back 100 years, and these are all none of these happen by chance. These aren't mysteries. We know why and the processes that have led to indicators being in the shape that they are in the southern states now.
Okay, so that was my final question about politics, Rukmini. I'm just going to move to crime because you have dealt with crime quite a bit. Now, Rukmini is a journalist who's done significant work to show that official statistics often misreport non criminal activity as crime. For example, in 2013, she studied 600 judgments of rape and found that 460 of them actually dealt with consenting adults. That is, two adults are in a consenting relationship, but the majority of rape cases were filed by parents who disapproved of their relationship. So, what Rukmini says is that using data without context may not give the whole picture. But Rukmini, being a journalist yourself, what do you think is the way out? Because stories on crime data without any nuance are all over the place.
This is a hard one also, because I know of the limitations in which newsrooms operate. And I think there is some amount of work that someone like me who does things much later or in a book can do, which a daily beat reporter can't necessarily do. So I don't expect the beat reporter to, be able to read every court judgment, for example. But what I would expect from newsrooms, and of course, this can't come from individual reporters, these have to be guidelines perhaps established across newsrooms and then really, enforced within newsrooms. There has to be an overhaul in crime reporting in this country. It's in an absolute, it's in a moral hole, the place that crime reporting exists in right now. And it seems like a terrible thing for a journalist, especially in these times, to ask for regulation, because we know the things that it can lead to. But I'm sorry, crime reporting in this country needs regulation. It defies and goes against the rights of not just complainants but also the accused, and we should not be drawing lines based on whether we like the accused or not. The same rules should be applying even in the most quote unquote heinous cases, and we don't see that. We see the media having a field day. So I think the way most daily media reporting of crimes occurs, which is for the police to put out an FIR and for the media to faithfully report the contents of that FIR, it's doing serious damage to most people's understanding of the country. It's the basis on which people form views around safety. They take decisions about where to live, about which college to go to. All of these things are being formed on the basis of FIRs, which all of us know are far from being statements of fact. They sort of represent the push and pull of society as much as they do whether a crime has been reported or not. So yeah, I really do think we need to have a very long hard think about what to do about crime reporting in the country, because recently I was reading in the UK about the final outcome of a trial involving a police officer who had abducted and sexually assaulted and killed a young woman in London. And I realized from the news reporting that it was only at the time of conviction that the media was even told that she had been sexually assaulted prior to death. Can you just imagine, in India on day one, we would have known all of this. We would have been given every lurid detail and it would have all been on every front page. But there is no sort of ethical grounds on which so much information has to be released in the public sphere prior to convictions.
No, I completely agree with you. And that's something for the readers also to know. For example, when you read a story like more rapes reported from Tamil Nadu or Kerala, what the reporter is perhaps not telling you is that these states have a robust system of reporting. They've sensitized their police officers and the general public that you can come forward and report crimes. So more number of crimes do not generally mean that more crimes have happened. So many crimes have happened, but many crimes also go unreported. So nuance in reporting, especially when it's data, is important. My next question to Rukmini is about the Juvenile Justice Act.
I can just jump in about the previous point that you made, which is very important. And I think it also raises a larger question about how we do all interstate comparisons in the country. When we are in a country in which there's such a big difference between states in terms of development indicators, empowerment, state capacity, this applies as much to COVID as it does to crime. Because when we take large numbers in one state to be equal to a lot of things happening in that state, whether it is crime or COVID, what we're doing is we're sort of discounting the role that state capacity plays in this. So I've really reached a point where I feel bad that what we're doing is basically penalizing states that do a better job of reporting for having a large number of crimes or COVID cases in that, as the case may be. So yeah, I think we need to have a sort of fresh look at how the media reports interstate numbers of all sorts.
Okay, my next question to you is the India's Juvenile Justice Act. So in 2013, India had raised the age at which a woman could consent to sex from 16 to 18. Now, what did this do? This resulted in a lot of teenage boys and young men who are in consensual relationships also get arrested under the law for having a relationship with a woman who's between 16 and 18. Over the years, many POCSO activists, many others have called this law problematic. You have looked at the data, Rukmini. What is your opinion about the law?
So, just the genesis of the law itself happened in very unfortunate circumstances. And I think it should give rise to conversation about how all laws enacted after, crimes that sort of quote unquote shake the conscience of society are enacted. This happened in the context of media reporting that one of the accused in the 2012 Delhi attack, who was a juvenile, was quote unquote the most heinous. And this has subsequently been proved to not be the fact. But and I think the fact that he is a Muslim played a significant role in why the media ended up reporting this letters. But all of this taken together had the impact of this decision to raise the age of consent, which I think is a absolutely retrograde step. And one of the things that things that judges were doing when I spoke to them about this is that when men were in relationships with women who were under the legal age, which was 18 at the time, but if this was a consenting relationship and even the woman deposed in court, the girl deposed in court that this was a relationship with her consent, the judges would sort of take a lenient view and either sentence the man to the time already served or that sort of thing. Two things happen. One is that the age of consent was raised to 18, and the other thing that happened is that this discretion was taken away from judges, so they can't play this role anymore. Now what has happened subsequently is, because these are regarded as cases under POCSO, they are also not publicly available. They're not reported in the same way in the legal judicial system, and I suppose that is with good reason to protect identity, though we can argue for anonymized data to be accessible for analysis. But what other researchers who have had access to some of this data, like Bharti Ali of the organization Haq, they found that the same sort of pattern that I was finding in adult cases is being played out in POCSO cases as well, which is that a large share of sexual assault cases are actually teenage love. It's basically the criminalization of teenage love, and a sharp edge to it is that these are often intercaste or interreligious couples, and given the sort of spate of laws or guidelines being passed by states to make interreligious marriage tougher, this is only going to get harder.
I mean, just as we speak, Karnataka is going to have a law which will make interreligious weddings even more tougher. So, in fact, in the book, Rukmini says that the law places young men in romantic relationship in the same category as pedophiles. So we have spoken about politics, we have spoken about crime. The last section of the book deals with health and, of course, where Indians live. In that, Rukmini, one thing I found very interesting is that a constant narrative we read in news stories, books, or even experts telling us everywhere is that India is urbanizing rapidly. There is an urban explosion. But you have questioned that narrative. Why did you do that? And how does the data back that?
Yeah, so I would definitely say that's one of the things that surprised me when I went into this. I didn't expect to be finding that. I would imagine that we're seeing a rural to urban migration explosion and an urbanization explosion. And I think the real question that actually puzzles experts in the field is, why is there such little migration and why is there such little urbanization? So, of course, there are nuances within this that, there are some who ask whether India's definition of urbanization is too narrow, and if the definition was a little more liberal, then perhaps the rate of urbanization would be higher in the data. There's also questions around migration that we only end up measuring pretty permanent migration. If you were measuring slightly temporary or seasonal migration, would be capturing more. But yes, I think this is one of those things that has become sort of a much beloved, widely held narrative, while the question that came after the last census and perhaps will emerge after the next census as well is, why are we not urbanizing fast enough? And I suppose it raises difficult questions. It asks questions about whether big cities or even smaller cities are proving to be the sort of engines of growth that they were once imagined to be. And I think one of the things we often don't realize also is that migration is expensive. We picture migration as something that the poorest do as a sort of means of last resort, but you need to be in reasonable economic shape to even attempt migration. Smaller, shorter, sort of desperate acts of local seasonal migration are things that poorer people from more marginalized communities do, but sort of long distance, more permanent migration needs some money to even be able to attempt to do that. So yeah, I do think this is a sort of warped idea that we have about the country, and we really should, internationally the question really is, why is India not urbanizing fast enough given its level of income and other things?
So another interesting takeaway for me from the book was how you looked at the migrant population. In fact, you have said that states like richer western and southern states, people there might tell you that migrants from the north are flooding them, but that's not entirely true, you have said.
Yes, I think, again, when you talk of permanent migration, we sometimes don't realize just how rare it is. To live outside the place you were born is a rarity in India. It makes you a tiny minority, an outlier in the country. We are not a mass migrating, permanent migrating country. But one of the things that research by people like, the historian Chinmay Tumbe have shown is that one of the things we miss other types of migration. We miss more sort of seasonal and shorter term migration. And this sort of north south moving for years and moving here to take up jobs, that sort of migration is actually quite rare. And we see it, we see the weaponization and the politicization of it to sort of drum up anti-outsider sentiment. We can see why that is harped on, but simultaneously what is also happening is that we are missing a lot of shorter term migration. And it's dangerous that we're missing this, because these tend to be some of the most vulnerable people. And I think this was really played out during the lockdown, when so many people were kind of horrified at the number of people who were undertaking these journeys on foot. And the question was, just wait a little longer, things will get better, the state is providing something. But we didn't realize just how precarious these lives were, that these were sort of precarious journeys taken in for families with very little elbow room, who even a few days of not earning, it was calamitous for them.
So my final question to you, Rukmini, is that in many parts of the book, in through your chapters, you've also touched upon fights over data. For example, in one place, you talk about how experts could not agree why Indians are shorter in height compared to many other groups. Is it because of stunting, malnutrition, or genetics? So, through all your times while reporting data, you must have covered a lot of these disagreements. Can you recall any instances, and do you believe that this sort of going back and forth on data, on disagreements, is very important, because it also leads to significant understanding of a subject?
Absolutely. When these debates are had in good faith, they advance our knowledge. And I think even the stunting and the heights discussion was, to a point, a discussion that has really advanced our knowledge, because there was a point at which stunting was seen as purely an effect of malnutrition alone. I'm leaving the genetics part of it, because the genetic component to it is now very well understood, and people who sort of drum it up again are doing it for pretty political reasons. They are the ones who do not want to confront things like malnutrition or inequality, which we now know plays a bigger role. But the discussion that happened post malnutrition, maybe in the last, say, 10 years or so, on heights, has been important, because it's brought in two important factors that were not given enough attention in the past. One is the role of inequality, because upper castes just are taller than people from scheduled caste households, for example. And we know things like the younger daughter-in-law in a household tends to eat less and then have shorter children, because the distribution of family resources ends up discriminating against younger daughters-in-law. We know that happens. We also know now about the role that sanitation plays. That this was an ignored aspect of heights, but now we know that an area that has greater levels of open defecation would also mean that both pregnant women and young children have much more episodes of diarrheal disease when they're young, which means that they're not able to grow to their full potential. So this is an area in which our understanding has improved, and stunting has moved from a sort of direct measure of malnutrition alone to, in a way, a sort of integrated indicator that brings together multiple inequalities and multiple sort of elements of deprivation within the country. The evolution of stunting as an indicator itself is a very good example of debates advancing knowledge.
When you speak about this, I remember this case where a Malayalam actor called Reema Kallingal had said that in her household, for example, when fish fry was made, her father would be given her brother, and then perhaps she and her mother would get, if there were any pieces remaining. And she was made fun of for so many years. In fact, people continue to do that. They call her fish fry whenever she puts up a post without understanding data, like what you just explained. The data clearly shows that the woman in the household tends to eat lesser than the children or the men in the household, right? So, Rukmini, yeah.
This is something that that is now so well recognized as a data point, that there are surveys that actually ask the question that in your household, do the women eat last? This is now an established development indicator. So it's very unfortunate that she was made fun of for that. It's a development economist would commend her for saying that, because it is an established indicator.
Well, Anyway, thank you for that, Rukmini. So I had a really great time reading the book, and I would recommend everyone who is interested in numbers, in knowing how India eats, feels, votes, and how India is very conservative, and why, if you believe in free speech and liberty, that we all need to do something for it. You need to really read the book. So thank you very much, Rukmini, for speaking to me.
Thank you so much for having me, Dhanya. Thank you.